My brother thought 2 minutes of laughter was worth my 2 years in a coma, but now I'm the one who is laughing. I woke up screaming. Not the gentle movie-style awakening where someone slowly opens their eyes and asks where they are. I woke up thrashing against restraints I didn't know existed, tubes choking me, machines shrieking alarms, and nurses rushing in to hold me down while I fought like an animal. My first conscious thought in 2 years was pure animal panic, convinced I was suffocating, dying, trapped. The second thought was confusion so profound it felt like drowning. The third thought, once the sedatives they'd pumped into my IV took hold, was wondering why my fiancée looked 10 years older than I remembered. Kara's face was lined with exhaustion, her hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there before, and when she grabbed my hand and sobbed my name, her engagement ring was gone, replaced by a thin gold wedding band I'd never seen. The neurologist who came to evaluate me had the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered devastating news regularly. Dr. Okafor explained in careful measured tones that I'd been in a medically induced coma for 103 days following severe diabetic ketoacidosis that had caused multiple organ failure, and then in a persistent vegetative state for an additional 627 days when my brain showed minimal activity. 2 years total. 730 days of my life simply erased while the world continued without me. She asked if I understood what she was telling me, and I tried to speak, but my vocal cords had atrophied from disuse. The sound that came out was a raspy croak that didn't sound human. Kara translated my attempts at speech, her voice cracking as she explained we'd gotten married in a courthouse ceremony while I was still semi-conscious during month 4, because my insurance required spousal status for her to make medical decisions when my parents couldn't agree on treatment. My body had forgotten how to be a body. Physical therapy started the morning after I woke, a therapist named Jerome guiding my wasted muscles through movements that should have been automatic. Lifting my arm required concentration that left me sweating. Gripping a cup was impossible with hands that shook uncontrollably. My legs looked like they belonged to someone else, thin and pale and useless. Jerome explained that 2 years of immobility had destroyed muscle mass I'd spent my whole life building. I'd been a runner before this, training for a marathon while completing my commercial pilot certification. Now I couldn't walk 10 feet without collapsing. The mirror they finally let me see showed a stranger, someone gaunt and hollow-eyed who looked closer to 50 than 24. My pilot physique was gone, replaced by skin hanging loose over bones, and when I tried to ask what happened to me, my slurred speech sounded drunk. Kara sat beside my hospital bed that night and explained the 2 years I'd lost in a voice that suggested she'd practiced this speech multiple times. We'd been living with my older brother Garrett when it happened. I'd been feeling off for a few days, tired and nauseous, but had attributed it to stress from pilot training finals and wedding planning. The night I collapsed, I'd done my usual insulin injection before bed, kissed her goodnight, and told her I loved her. She'd found me the next morning unconscious in our bathroom, foam coming from my mouth, my skin gray and cold. The paramedics said my blood sugar was over 800. The hospital said I'd been without effective insulin for at least 3 days. My kidneys had shut down from the prolonged ketoacidosis, and I'd had a stroke during the ambulance ride that caused the brain damage keeping me comatose. The details she provided felt like listening to someone else's tragedy. She described the first month of not knowing if I'd survive, the kidney failure requiring constant dialysis, the infections that kept developing from all the tubes keeping me alive. She talked about month 3, when doctors suggested moving me to long-term care because they didn't expect me to wake up. She explained how my pilot certification had been revoked immediately, how my student loans had gone into forbearance but accumulated $30,000 in interest, how medical bills had exceeded $800,000 before insurance caps kicked in. She mentioned almost casually that we'd lost our apartment, and she'd moved in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent while spending every day at the hospital. Every sentence revealed another thing stolen from me while I was trapped in darkness. My older brother Garrett visited the next day, and I didn't recognize him at first. He'd gained weight, maybe 40 pounds, and wore an expensive suit that suggested significant income increase. His face did something strange when he saw me conscious, a flash of what looked almost like fear before it shifted to exaggerated relief. He grabbed me in a hug that hurt my atrophied muscles and said he'd been praying for this moment every single day. His voice cracked authentically, and when he pulled back, there were real tears in his eyes. He told me he'd felt so guilty, like he should have noticed something was wrong before it got critical, that he'd been staying with me, and should have realized my insulin wasn't working. The guilt seemed to consume him as he talked, his hands shaking as he described watching me collapse into unconsciousness and being helpless to prevent it. The cognitive therapist, Dr. Patel, started testing my brain function once I'd been awake for a week. She gave me puzzles designed for children, and I struggled to complete them. Simple math problems that should have been automatic required minutes of concentration. Reading felt like decoding a foreign language, the words swimming on the page before my damaged visual processing could make sense of them. Memory was the worst part. I remembered my childhood clearly, high school in perfect detail, but the 6 months before the coma were fragmented and unreliable. Dr. Patel explained that the stroke had damaged my hippocampus, the part of the brain that forms new memories. I'd likely never recover those lost months completely. My pilot training, my engagement to Kara, moving in with Garrett, all of it existed only in disconnected snapshots rather than coherent narrative. Kara brought photo albums to help jog my memory, and I studied pictures of a life I apparently lived but couldn't recall. There was me in a pilot uniform during training, grinning confidently at the camera. Me and Kara looking at wedding venues, her showing me fabric swatches while I pretended to care. Me and Garrett at some bar, arms around each other's shoulders, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. The photos proved these moments happened, but they felt like someone else's experiences. The person in those pictures looked happy and healthy and normal. The person staring back from my hospital mirror looked like a corpse that forgot to die. The disconnect made me want to scream, this evidence of a life interrupted that I couldn't actually remember living. My younger sister Alexis flew in from Seattle during week 2 of my consciousness. She was 20 years old now, no longer the teenager I remembered, and she'd cut her hair short and dyed it purple. She cried when she saw me, but recovered quickly, pulling herself together with visible effort. We'd always been close, the kind of siblings who could communicate without words, and within minutes of her arrival, I saw her studying me with an expression I couldn't quite name. She asked detailed questions about what I remembered from before the coma, taking notes on her phone like she was conducting an investigation. When I mentioned the fragmented memories and the confusion about my insulin failing, her expression went very still and cold. She excused herself to take a call, and I heard her voice through the door, sharp and urgent, though I couldn't make out words. The financial devastation became clear when Kara showed me the paperwork she'd been managing for 2 years. Medical bills totaling $1.2 million, most covered by insurance, but leaving us responsible for $180,000 in deductibles and co-pays. My student loans now totaled $110,000 with accumulated interest. Kara's credit cards were maxed at $40,000 from expenses insurance didn't cover. We'd lost everything we'd saved for a wedding and a house and our future, and were now drowning in debt that would take decades to pay off. Kara's nursing salary covered her portion of expenses at her parents' house, but there was nothing left over. We were functionally bankrupt at 24 and 23, our lives derailed completely by 3 days of unexplained insulin failure that nobody could adequately explain. Garrett visited every other day, and each visit felt more performative than the last. He'd bring expensive coffee and magazines and talk about his promotion at the marketing firm where he worked. He'd gotten engaged to someone named Olivia while I was comatose, he explained, because my situation had taught him life was short and you had to seize happiness. He showed me photos of a woman who looked like she belonged in fashion magazines and talked about the condo he'd bought downtown with his increased salary. He mentioned casually that he'd started a GoFundMe for my medical expenses that had raised $80,000, and he was holding the money in a separate account to make sure it was used responsibly for actual medical costs. The way he emphasized responsibly made Kara's face go hard and dangerous. When Garrett left that day, Kara turned to me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Quiet, cold fury that made her voice shake when she spoke. She told me Garrett had transferred exactly $12,000 of that GoFundMe money over the entire 2 years, always with lengthy explanations about platform fees and disputed donations and needing to verify bills before releasing funds. She'd begged him multiple times for the rest because we were drowning in medical debt and couldn't afford my medications. He'd always promised it was coming soon. He was just making sure everything was documented properly, but the money never materialized beyond those small installments. Meanwhile, his social media showed him buying a condo, taking expensive vacations, proposing with a ring that cost more than our annual rent. She'd wanted to confront him legally but couldn't afford a lawyer, and without proof of wrongdoing, she had no recourse. My parents visited during week 3, and they looked like they'd aged a decade each. Mom had developed a tremor in her hands, and Dad walked with a cane from a knee surgery I'd missed while comatose. They sat on either side of my bed and cried while holding my hands, and I could feel the weight of 2 years of grief and fear and helplessness radiating from them. Dad explained they'd driven up from Phoenix every weekend for the first 6 months, spending money they didn't have on gas and hotels, until their savings were depleted and they couldn't manage the trips anymore. They'd sold their house and moved into a smaller apartment to cover unexpected costs insurance didn't handle. Mom had taken a part-time job despite being past retirement age. Their entire life had been reorganized around my medical catastrophe, and now they had nothing left to give except their presence. Garrett threw himself an engagement party while I was in week 4 of physical therapy. The invitation appeared on social media, a fancy event at some upscale venue with a professional photographer and a signature cocktail named after the couple. Kara showed me the posts afterward. Photos of Garrett and Olivia surrounded by friends and colleagues, everyone dressed expensively and drinking champagne. Multiple photos showed Garrett giving speeches, and though there was no audio, the captions quoted him talking about how my medical crisis had taught him to appreciate life and seize moments of joy. People commented about how inspiring and profound he was, how beautiful the event looked, How lucky Olivia was to marry someone so emotionally mature. Looking at those photos from my hospital bed where I was relearning how to walk, I felt something dark and cold settle into my chest. Alexis came back during week 5 and brought her laptop. She sat down beside my bed with the determined expression that meant she'd been researching something obsessively, and pulled up files she'd been compiling. She explained that she'd been suspicious about my insulin failure from the beginning because type 1 diabetics don't just suddenly lose effectiveness for no reason, and nobody had adequately investigated how it happened. She'd started digging through medical records she'd requested as family, and found something disturbing. The insulin vials retrieved from the apartment after my collapse had been tested and came back as expired saline solution, not insulin. Someone had switched my medication with salt water, and I'd been injecting useless fluid for days while my blood sugar skyrocketed. The police report mentioned this finding, but concluded I must have accidentally purchased wrong product online. Except Alexis had checked my purchase history, and every order showed legitimate insulin from verified pharmacies. The revelation made my vision narrow to a single point. Someone had deliberately swapped my insulin with saline, essentially poisoning me through deprivation of medication I needed to survive. The police had investigated this as an unfortunate accident rather than attempted murder, and nobody had pushed for further inquiry. Alexis had more information, though, her face grim as she pulled up additional files. She'd submitted Freedom of Information requests for the full police investigation, and buried in the paperwork was a detail that investigators had apparently dismissed. A neighbor had doorbell camera footage from the hallway outside our apartment, showing Garrett entering my room multiple times during the 3 days before I collapsed, always late at night when I was asleep and Kara was working night shifts. The footage showed him carrying a small bag during these visits, entering my room, staying for 3 to 5 minutes, then leaving. The timestamps corresponded exactly to the period when my insulin was swapped. I stared at the timestamp evidence and felt my reality shift sideways. Garrett had been in my room late at night, multiple times, during the exact period when someone replaced my insulin with saline solution. The coincidence was impossible to dismiss. Alexis said she'd shown this evidence to the original investigating officer and been told that Garrett had explained he was checking on me during those visits because he'd noticed I seemed unwell. The officer had accepted this explanation without further questioning because brothers checking on brothers didn't seem suspicious. But Alexis pointed out that Garrett had never mentioned noticing I was unwell in any of his statements at the hospital. He'd claimed complete surprise when I collapsed. The contradiction suggested his story to police had been a prepared cover that nobody bothered to verify. The physical therapist found me hyperventilating in my room an hour after Alexis left, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't grip the call button. Jerome sat with me while I processed what I'd learned, and he made me practice breathing exercises until my panic attack subsided. He'd worked with enough trauma patients to recognize what emotional crisis looked like, and he didn't push for explanations when I couldn't speak coherently. He just stayed until I could breathe normally again, and told me that whatever I was dealing with mentally was just as important as the physical recovery. I wanted to explain about Garrett, about the switched insulin, about 2 years of my life stolen by someone who was supposed to protect me, but the words wouldn't come, stuck behind the horror of understanding that my own brother had tried to kill me. Kara returned that evening, and I told her everything Alexis had discovered. She listened without interrupting, her face going progressively paler as I explained about the saline solution and the doorbell footage and Garrett's contradictory statements. When I finished, she was silent for a full minute before speaking in a voice that shook with barely controlled rage. She said she'd always felt something was wrong about Garrett's behavior, the way he'd been so helpful but so controlling about the GoFundMe money, how he'd isolated me from friends during my recovery by claiming I needed rest, how he'd volunteered to manage my medications and paperwork while I was comatose. She'd attributed it to misguided brotherly concern, but now every action looked like someone covering tracks and maintaining control over a victim. The thought made her physically ill. We called Alexis back, and the 3 of us spent the night going through every piece of evidence she'd collected. The doorbell footage was time-stamped and clear, showing Garrett's face as he looked around nervously before entering my room. The medical records confirmed the insulin vials contained saline. The police report showed the investigation had been cursory and incomplete, accepting Garrett's explanations without verification. Alexis had also found something else, Garrett's Amazon purchase history from 3 weeks before my collapse. He'd ordered a 12-pack of saline vials, the exact type used for wound irrigation, delivered to his office address. When she'd confronted him about this, he'd claimed he needed them for a first aid kit he was assembling. But first aid kits don't require 12 vials of saline solution, and the timing was too coincidental to dismiss. Kara wanted to go to the police immediately, but Alexis urged caution. The original investigation had closed with an accidental determination, and reopening it would require new evidence compelling enough to overcome prosecutorial reluctance. We needed more than circumstantial connections. We needed something that proved deliberate intent. Alexis suggested we gather everything we could find before approaching authorities, build an irrefutable case that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She'd already started compiling a timeline of Garrett's financial situation, before and after my coma. He'd been struggling with debt before my collapse, credit cards maxed and rent payments late. After I went comatose, he'd gotten the promotion, the condo purchase, the expensive engagement. The financial turnaround was dramatic and suspicious. I couldn't confront Garrett while processing this information because I didn't trust myself not to attack him physically despite my weakened state. The rage was incandescent, burning through me like acid, eating away at every memory I had of brotherly bonding and family loyalty. Every visit he'd made to my hospital bed had been performance. Every tear had been manipulation. Every expression of guilt had been calculated to deflect suspicion. He'd tried to murder me, and when that hadn't worked, he'd stolen from me and profited from my suffering. And he'd done it all while playing the devoted brother on social media, soaking up sympathy and admiration from people who had no idea what he really was. The injustice of it made simple breathing feel like violence. Alexis found the smoking gun on day 63 of my consciousness. She'd been going through Garrett's social media history methodically, downloading everything before he could delete it, and found something he'd apparently forgotten existed. A private Instagram story from the night before I collapsed, visible only to his close friends list, showing a short video. The video was dark and grainy, shot from a doorway, showing someone who was clearly me sleeping in my bed. Garrett's voice whispered from behind the camera, saying, "Watch this, I'm gonna mess with Golden Boy's insulin." Then the video panned to show Garrett's hands holding up two vials, one clearly labeled insulin and another unmarked. His face appeared in frame for just a moment, grinning at the camera. Then his friends' voices from off-screen, laughing and saying, "Bro, you're so evil," and he has no idea. The video was 2 minutes and 17 seconds long. It showed Garrett opening my mini fridge where I kept my insulin, swapping the vials while his friends filmed and laughed from the doorway. Someone asked, "What's that gonna do?" And Garrett responded, "Make him too sick to take that pilot exam Monday. Maybe he'll realize he's not so perfect after all." More laughter. Someone else saying, "Dude, that's hardcore." Garrett responding, "It's just saline. He'll be fine after a few days of feeling like shit." Then the video ended with Garrett turning off my bedroom light and closing the door while his friends continued laughing in the hallway. 2 minutes of video evidence showing premeditated poisoning while multiple people laughed, and none of them had considered the consequences beyond making me temporarily ill. Alexis had found the video through one of Garrett's friends who'd been tagged in the original story. The friend, someone named Kyle, had kept a screenshot of the story before it disappeared after 24 hours. When Alexis contacted him, explaining she was investigating my medical crisis, Kyle had initially claimed ignorance. But when she mentioned the video might be evidence in a criminal case, he'd panicked and sent her the file along with text messages from that night. The texts showed Garrett bragging about his plan to his friend group, explaining he was going to swap my insulin to make me sick enough to miss my pilot certification exam. He'd been jealous that I was succeeding in aviation while his marketing career stagnated. The texts from his friends ranged from encouragement to mild concern, but nobody had tried to stop him or warned me about what was coming. We took everything to the police the next morning. Alexis, Kara, and I sat in a detective's office and presented 2 years of compiled evidence: the video, the doorbell footage, the Amazon purchases, the financial timeline, the text messages. The detective, a woman named Rivera, watched the video 3 times without speaking, her expression darkening with each replay. When it finished, she asked why nobody had brought this to police attention sooner. Alexis explained that the video had only recently been recovered, that the original investigation had accepted Garrett's story without scrutinizing his actions, and that as family members, we'd been focused on my survival rather than criminal prosecution. Rivera said this changed everything, and she'd be reopening the investigation immediately with attempted murder as the working theory. The next 72 hours moved with startling speed. Detective Rivera interviewed Kyle and the other friends visible in the video, all of whom confirmed the events of that night. She obtained warrants for Garrett's phone records and financial documents. She brought in a medical expert who testified that removing insulin from a type 1 diabetic for 3 days was potentially lethal, and that Garrett's claim he thought I'd just be sick for a few days showed either criminal negligence or deliberate intent to cause severe harm. The district attorney's office reviewed the case and determined there was sufficient evidence to file charges. On day 75 of my consciousness, exactly 11 weeks after I'd woken up, police arrested Garrett at his office in front of his colleagues. The charge was attempted murder through deprivation of life-sustaining medication. Garrett's first phone call from jail was to our parents, claiming this was all a misunderstanding, that the video had been taken out of context, that he'd been joking with his friends and never actually swapped any insulin. Mom called me crying, begging me to tell police this was a mistake, that Garrett would never actually hurt me. I had to explain about the saline vials found in my medications, about the doorbell footage showing him in my room, about his Amazon purchase history and the text messages planning the whole thing. Mom's crying intensified and Dad took the phone, his voice hollow, as he asked if I was certain. I told him I was certain, and that Garrett had also stolen most of the GoFundMe money meant for my medical bills. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought they'd hung up. The preliminary hearing happened during week 12 of my consciousness. I attended in a wheelchair because walking still exhausted me, with Kara pushing me and Alexis on my other side. Garrett was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suit and confident demeanor replaced by something diminished and desperate. His lawyer, a public defender who looked overwhelmed, tried arguing the video showed a prank that went wrong rather than attempted murder. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Chen, played the 2-minute video for the judge and let it speak for itself. The laughter, the deliberate swap, Garrett's own words about wanting me to miss my exam, his friends commenting on how evil it was. The judge watched without expression, then ruled there was sufficient probable cause to proceed to trial. Bail was set at $500,000, which Garrett's fiancée Olivia declined to post. She'd apparently already left him after learning about the charges. The GoFundMe investigation ran parallel to the criminal case. Detective Rivera had referred the matter to a financial crimes unit, and they'd subpoenaed all of Garrett's bank records. The analysis showed that of the $80,000 raised for my medical expenses, Garrett had transferred only $12,000 to Kara over 2 years. The remaining $68,000 had been systematically moved into his personal accounts, used for his condo down payment, for Olivia's engagement ring, for furniture and vacations, and luxury purchases. Every donor who'd contributed thinking they were helping my medical recovery had actually funded my brother's lifestyle upgrade. The Financial Crimes Unit filed separate charges for fraud and theft by deception. The maximum sentence for these charges combined with attempted murder was 45 years. Garrett's defense attorney tried negotiating a plea deal. He approached the prosecutor offering to plead guilty to aggravated assault instead of attempted murder, claiming Garrett had only meant to make me sick, not kill me, and that my 2-year coma was an unforeseeable consequence of the prank. The prosecutor rejected this outright. The medical evidence showed that removing insulin from a type 1 diabetic for 3 days created life-threatening risk that any reasonable person would understand. Garrett's own text messages showed he'd researched diabetic ketoacidosis before executing his plan, which proved he understood the potential consequences. The video showed him laughing about making me sick. There would be no deal. The case would go to trial, and a jury would decide whether Garrett's actions constituted attempted murder. My physical recovery progressed slowly but steadily through the months leading to trial. I graduated from wheelchair to walker to cane, each advancement feeling like climbing a mountain. Dr. Patel worked with me on cognitive rehabilitation, and my memory and processing improved enough that I could hold conversations without losing track of my thoughts. The tremor in my hands lessened. My speech became clearer. I'd never be the person I was before the coma, the pilot with a bright future and a confident stride. But I was becoming someone functional enough to testify coherently at my brother's trial. That goal sustained me through the brutal physical therapy sessions and the cognitive exercises that left me exhausted. Kara and I moved into a small studio apartment with money donated by friends who'd learned about the GoFundMe theft. The disability payments had finally begun, providing enough income to cover basic living expenses. We couldn't afford anything luxurious, but we had our own space again, our own bed, our own kitchen. Kara set up my medications in a locked box that only she had the combination to, and she watched me take each dose personally. She'd developed severe anxiety about anything related to my diabetes management, and I couldn't blame her. Someone had weaponized my medical condition to try killing me. The trauma of that reality would linger long after any physical recovery was complete. Trust had been shattered in ways that would take years to rebuild. The trial began on a Monday in September, 14 months after I'd woken from the coma, and 26 months after Garrett had poisoned me. Jury selection took 3 days as Garrett's attorney eliminated anyone with medical conditions or family members with medical conditions, trying to prevent jurors from relating too closely to my situation. The final jury was 8 men and 4 women, ranging in age from late 20s to retirement, with occupations spanning from teacher to engineer to retail worker. They looked skeptical and serious as they were sworn in, and I wondered what they saw when they looked at Garrett in his ill-fitting suit, or at me with my cane and visible disability. The prosecutor's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through Garrett's jealousy about my pilot success, his financial struggles before my coma, the premeditated planning shown in his Amazon purchases and text messages. She played the 2-minute video on a large screen so every juror could see Garrett's face as he laughed and swapped my insulin while his friends filmed and encouraged him. She explained how type 1 diabetics die without insulin, how 3 days of saline solution instead of medication had caused ketoacidosis that led to kidney failure and stroke and 2 years of coma. She pointed to me sitting in the gallery with my cane and asked the jury to remember that Garrett's prank had stolen my entire 20s and left me permanently disabled. Then she pointed to Garrett and said he'd spent those same 2 years profiting from my suffering while playing the devoted brother on social media. Garrett's defense attorney gave an opening statement that tried painting him as a foolish younger sibling who'd made a terrible mistake with unintended consequences. He emphasized that Garrett never meant to cause serious harm, that he genuinely believed I'd just be sick for a few days, that the coma and disability were tragic outcomes nobody could have predicted. He pointed out that Garrett had visited me regularly in the hospital and had started the GoFundMe to help with medical costs. which showed he cared about my well-being. He asked the jury to consider whether a momentary lapse in judgment deserved the same punishment as deliberate attempted murder. The argument felt hollow given the video evidence, but I could see a few jurors nodding thoughtfully. Reasonable doubt was a powerful thing. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Okafor, my neurologist, who explained in clinical detail what happens to a type 1 diabetic without insulin. She described how blood sugar rises to toxic levels, how the body goes into ketoacidosis, how organs begin shutting down, how brain damage occurs from prolonged metabolic crisis. She testified that 3 days without insulin created life-threatening risk, and that any adult with basic medical knowledge would understand this. Under cross-examination, Garrett's attorney asked if some people survive diabetic ketoacidosis without permanent damage. Dr. Okafor acknowledged this was true, but emphasized that survival depended on receiving emergency treatment quickly. Without my fiancée finding me when she did, I would have died. The attorney tried suggesting my coma was unusually severe, implying bad luck rather than inevitable consequence. Dr. Okafor shut this down firmly, explaining that severe outcomes were common when ketoacidosis went untreated for over 72 hours. Detective Rivera testified about the investigation, walking the jury through the evidence she'd collected. She presented the saline vials found in my medication supply, the doorbell footage showing Garrett entering my room repeatedly, his Amazon purchase history, the text messages to friends discussing his plan. She explained how the original investigation had accepted Garrett's story without scrutiny, and how reopening the case with new evidence had revealed a clear pattern of premeditation. Under cross-examination, Garrett's attorney tried suggesting the doorbell footage could show innocent brotherly concern. Rivera responded that innocent concern doesn't require carrying saline vials into someone's room at 2 a.m. multiple nights in a row. The attorney asked if Detective Rivera had any direct evidence that Garrett physically touched my insulin. She said the video provided that evidence directly. Kyle testified on day 3, looking miserable as he explained his role in filming the video. The prosecutor asked him to describe that night, and he admitted they'd been drinking at Garrett's apartment when Garrett started complaining about me. His exact words, according to Kyle, were, "My little brother thinks he's so much better than me. Getting his pilot license while I'm stuck in a dead-end job. I'm going to make sure he misses his certification exam." Kyle and the other friends present had thought this was just drunk venting until Garrett actually pulled out saline vials and explained his plan. They'd thought it was dark humor until Garrett actually started walking toward my room. Then they'd filmed it because it seemed unreal, like watching someone do something so shocking you couldn't look away. The defense attorney's cross-examination tried to establish that everyone present was drunk and treating the situation as a joke, rather than serious intent to harm. Kyle agreed they were drunk, but said Garrett's actions seemed calculated rather than impulsive. He described how Garrett had specifically researched which vials looked identical to my insulin packaging, how he'd waited for nights when Kara was working so I'd be alone, how he'd timed his room entries for after I'd gone to sleep. This wasn't drunk spontaneity, it was planned execution. When asked why he hadn't stopped Garrett or warned me, Kyle said he'd thought about it afterward but convinced himself that Garrett wouldn't actually go through with swapping my medication for 3 full days. By the time he realized Garrett was serious, I was already in the hospital. The other friend who'd been present that night testified similarly, describing Garrett's jealousy and his stated intent to make me sick enough to miss my exam. Both friends presented text messages from Garrett in the days following my collapse. Messages where he'd written, "Holy shit, I didn't think it would be this bad," and "What if he dies?" and "Should I tell someone what I did?" His friends had told him to stay quiet, that he'd go to prison if anyone found out. The text showed Garrett knew his actions had caused my medical crisis and consciously chose to hide his responsibility rather than come forward. This evidence demolished any defense argument that Garrett had been unaware of the consequences of his actions. Kara testified on day 5, and I watched from the gallery as she described finding me unconscious, performing CPR while waiting for paramedics, the 2 years of keeping vigil at my bedside without knowing if I'd ever wake up. She explained how Garrett had positioned himself as supportive family throughout this period, visiting regularly, helping coordinate my care, starting the GoFundMe campaign. She'd trusted him completely because he was my brother and seemed devastated by what had happened. The betrayal when she learned the truth had been compounded by realizing he'd been performing grief while actually responsible for causing it. Her voice shook with rage as she described begging Garrett for GoFundMe money to pay medical bills while he posted vacation photos on social media. The jury watched her with visible sympathy. The defense attorney's cross-examination of Kara tried suggesting she was financially motivated to support prosecution, hoping to recover the stolen GoFundMe money through civil suit. Kara's response was ice cold. She said no amount of money could compensate for watching the man she loved lie comatose for 2 years, or for the permanent disabilities he'd live with forever, or for the dreams and future that Garrett had stolen from both of us. She said she wanted Garrett in prison because he'd tried to murder my husband and felt no remorse, not because of any financial consideration. The attorney wisely dropped that line of questioning and Kara was dismissed. She came back to sit beside me, her hand finding mine, her touch grounding me through the surreal horror of watching my brother's trial. I testified on day 6. Walking to the witness stand with my cane, I felt every juror's eyes tracking my labored movement. The prosecutor asked me to describe my life before the coma, my pilot training, my engagement to Kara, my plans for the future. I explained about completing my commercial certification, about the job offer I'd received from a regional airline, about the life I'd been building. Then she asked me to describe waking up 2 years later to find everything gone. I talked about the confusion and terror, the physical devastation, the permanent disabilities that ended my aviation career. I described learning about Garrett's role, the feeling of betrayal compounded by all the hospital visits where he'd played the concerned brother. My voice stayed steady through most of it, but broke when describing what Garrett had stolen from me. The defense attorney's cross-examination tried to establish that Garrett and I had a good relationship before this incident, that there was no history of violence or animosity between us. I agreed our relationship had seemed good because I hadn't known my brother was capable of this. The attorney asked if I'd ever noticed Garrett being jealous. I said siblings are always somewhat competitive, but I'd never imagined it could lead to attempted murder. He asked if there was any possibility I'd accidentally taken expired medication and Garrett was being falsely accused. I gestured to the prosecutor's evidence table where the video still sat on display and said the video showed exactly what happened and there was no accident involved. The attorney had no effective response to that. Medical experts testified about the long-term consequences of my injuries. The nephrologist explained that my kidney damage was permanent and I'd need dialysis 3 times weekly for life unless I received a transplant. The neurologist detailed the brain damage from the stroke, the memory issues and processing deficits that would never fully resolve. An economist calculated my lifetime lost earnings from being unable to work as a commercial pilot, estimating $4.2 million in lost income over a career that would never happen. A physical therapist described the ongoing rehabilitation I'd require and the permanent mobility limitations I'd face. Each expert built a comprehensive picture of how Garrett's prank had destroyed not just 2 years, but my entire future. The financial crimes investigator testified about the GoFundMe theft, presenting bank records showing exactly how Garrett had diverted donated funds into personal accounts. She'd traced every dollar, showing his condo down payment, the engagement ring purchase, furniture and electronics, and vacations. She presented donor statements from people who'd contributed thinking they were helping with medical costs, describing their shock and anger upon learning Garrett had stolen their donations. The investigator calculated that after legitimate platform fees, Garrett had stolen $67,400 that belonged to me and Kara. He'd spent it on luxuries while we'd struggled with medical bankruptcy and unpaid bills. Garrett testified in his own defense on day 8, a risky decision his attorney had apparently advised against. He took the stand wearing a suit his family had presumably bought for trial, looking simultaneously defiant and terrified. His attorney walked him through a prepared narrative about regretting his actions, about being drunk and stupid that night, about never intending serious harm. Garrett claimed he genuinely believed I'd just be sick for a day or 2 and then recover. He said when I ended up in a coma, he'd been horrified and guilty, which was why he'd started the GoFundMe and visited me so regularly. He tried to explain the money issues by saying he'd planned to transfer all the funds eventually, but had been holding them to make sure they were used properly. The explanation sounded hollow even to sympathetic ears. The prosecutor's cross-examination demolished Garrett's testimony systematically. She presented his pre-coma search history, showing he'd researched diabetic ketoacidosis and its severity. She played his text messages, where he'd written about wanting me to miss my exam because he was jealous of my success. She asked him to explain why he'd lied to police, about noticing I was unwell if he was really just checking on me during those late-night room visits. Garrett stammered through answers that contradicted each other and the documented evidence. She asked about the GoFundMe money and why he'd used donations for a condo down payment if he'd planned to transfer the funds. He claimed he was investing it to grow the amount, but couldn't explain why he'd never told us about this investment strategy. The prosecutor played the 2-minute video one final time during cross-examination, asking Garrett to watch himself laughing as he swapped my insulin while his friends filmed. She asked what part of that video showed someone who cared about my well-being or who thought I'd just be sick for a day or 2. Garrett couldn't answer. She asked if he'd come forward after I collapsed to tell doctors what he'd done. He admitted he hadn't. She asked if he'd told anyone the truth during my 2 years comatose. He admitted he hadn't. She asked if he'd planned to ever confess if Alexis hadn't found the video. Garrett said he'd been planning to tell the truth eventually. The prosecutor asked when eventually was, and Garrett had no answer. She dismissed him with a final question that hung in the silent courtroom. You thought 2 minutes of laughter with your friends was worth your brother's entire life, didn't you? Closing arguments happened on day 9. The prosecutor walked the jury through every piece of evidence, the video, the text messages, the Amazon purchases, the doorbell footage, the medical testimony, Garrett's own contradictory statements. She emphasized that this wasn't a prank gone wrong, but a deliberate attempt to harm me that had succeeded beyond Garrett's apparent intentions. She pointed out that Garrett had never shown genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. He'd profited from my suffering for 2 years, stolen from donors who'd trusted him, and only expressed guilt when facing criminal charges. She asked the jury to hold Garrett accountable for attempting to murder his brother out of jealousy and for stealing from people who'd tried to help his victim. The defense attorney's closing argument tried one last time to characterize Garrett as foolish rather than malicious. He emphasized that Garrett had no prior criminal history, that he'd genuinely not understood how dangerous his actions were, that the severe consequences were unintended and tragic. He asked the jury to consider whether Garrett deserved 45 years in prison for a mistake, however terrible. He suggested that convicting Garrett of attempted murder would punish him for outcomes he didn't foresee rather than intent he actually possessed. The argument might have been compelling in a different case. But with the video showing Garrett laughing while deliberately removing my life-sustaining medication, it fell flat. The jury deliberated for 7 hours across a day and a half. The verdict came back guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, fraud, theft by deception. Garrett's face went white as the jury foreman read each guilty verdict, and his mother sobbed in the gallery behind him. Our mother, sobbing for the son who'd tried to kill her other son, and I felt nothing watching her cry. Some betrayals were too profound to allow sympathy, even for parents caught between their children. My father sat beside her looking carved from stone, and when the verdicts were finished, he stood and walked out without looking at Garrett once. The message was clear. He'd chosen sides, and Garrett was no longer his son. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later to allow time for pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. Those 6 weeks felt longer than the trial itself. I worked with Kara and Alexis on my victim impact statement, trying to articulate the totality of what Garrett had stolen from me. Not just 2 years of consciousness, or my pilot career, or my physical health, but my ability to trust family, my sense of safety in the world, my belief that people who loved you wouldn't deliberately try to destroy you. The statement grew to 12 pages before I'd covered everything, and even then, it felt inadequate. How do you quantify the loss of your entire imagined future in words? The sentencing hearing brought all of us back to the same courtroom. Garrett was let in wearing the orange jumpsuit he'd worn throughout trial, looking thinner and older than he had 6 weeks before. The judge, a black woman in her 60s named Washington, had a reputation for being tough but scrupulously fair. She'd presided over the trial with professional detachment, and I had no sense of how she'd viewed the evidence or what sentence she was considering. My victim impact statement was entered into the record, and I read portions of it aloud, describing the permanent injuries, the lost career, the financial devastation, the emotional trauma of being betrayed by someone I'd trusted completely. Kara read her own statement about the 2 years of keeping vigil and the ongoing care I'd need. Alexis spoke about the family fractured by Garrett's actions. Garrett's attorney presented his own mitigation evidence. Character witnesses testified about Garrett being a good employee and a caring friend, though none could explain away the video evidence. A psychologist hired by the defense testified that Garrett showed genuine remorse and low risk of reoffending, though the prosecutor's cross-examination revealed Garrett had been resistant and defensive throughout the evaluation. Garrett's mother gave a tearful plea for leniency, saying her son had made a terrible mistake but didn't deserve to lose decades of his life. The judge listened impassively to everything before taking a 30-minute recess to review her notes. When Judge Washington returned, her expression was grave. She addressed Garrett directly before announcing sentence, and her words were precise and damning. She noted that Garrett had engaged in premeditated conduct designed to harm his brother, that he'd known the potential consequences based on his research, that he'd shown no remorse until facing criminal charges, and that he'd compounded his crime by stealing from donors who'd tried to help his victim. She emphasized that the 2-minute video showed someone who found deliberately harming his brother entertaining, and that Garrett's subsequent actions proved he cared more about protecting himself than taking responsibility for nearly killing me. She said that while courts dealt with many cases of sibling rivalry, few involved such calculated cruelty combined with such sustained exploitation of the victim's suffering. The sentence was 42 years in state prison, 30 years for attempted murder, 8 years for fraud and theft, 4 years for aggravated assault, with sentences running consecutively rather than concurrently. Garrett would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of his sentence, meaning he'd be locked up for at least 36 years. He'd be 62 years old before having any chance at freedom. Judge Washington ordered him to pay full restitution of $400 for the stolen GoFundMe money, plus $180,000 for medical expenses not covered by insurance, amounts he'd likely never be able to pay from prison wages. She ordered him to have no contact with me, Kara, or Alexis for the duration of his sentence. Then she ordered the bailiffs to remove him. Garrett was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs while his mother screamed that the sentence was too harsh, that the judge was destroying another life, that this wasn't justice, but revenge. Judge Washington's response was cold and final. Your son attempted to murder his brother and stole from people trying to help that brother survive. 42 years is proportional to the harm he caused and the complete lack of remorse he's demonstrated. The bailiffs escorted Garrett's mother from the courtroom while my father remained seated, his face in his hands. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed us for reactions. The prosecutor gave a statement about justice being served and the importance of holding people accountable regardless of family relationships. Kara simply said she was grateful Garrett would never hurt anyone else. I didn't speak to reporters because there were no words adequate to describe how I felt watching my brother taken away in chains for trying to kill me. The months following sentencing brought unexpected complications. Garrett's conviction and the details of his crime became national news. The 2-minute video going viral across social media as an example of how jealousy could drive people to unconscionable acts. The video showed Garrett's face clearly as he laughed and swapped my insulin, and internet justice was swift and brutal. His former employer released a statement condemning his actions. His ex-fiancée gave an interview describing how she'd been manipulated. Every friend who'd been present that night faced social consequences, losing jobs or relationships when their role in filming and encouraging Garrett became public. Kyle posted a public apology that was thoroughly mocked and dismissed. The court of public opinion delivered its own verdicts that would follow these people forever. My parents effectively lost both sons. Garrett was imprisoned for decades, and I couldn't maintain relationship with them after watching Mom defend him at sentencing. They'd moved back to Phoenix and I'd blocked their numbers, unable to forgive them for choosing to support the son who'd tried to kill me rather than the son who'd survived. Alexis stayed in contact with them and reported they were devastated and regretful, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Some betrayals destroyed families permanently, and this was one of them. I had Kara and Alexis and a small circle of friends who'd supported me through everything. That had to be enough. The restitution money came slowly through the state's victim compensation fund, since Garrett would never earn enough in prison to pay it back himself. His seized assets, including the condo bought with stolen money, were sold and proceeds distributed to me and the defrauded GoFundMe donors. The total came to about $90,000 after legal fees, which helped with medical debt, but didn't make us whole. The lawsuit against GoFundMe's platform for inadequate fraud prevention was settled for an undisclosed amount that covered remaining medical bills and provided modest living expenses. Kara and I would never be wealthy, but we weren't drowning anymore. Financial stability felt like victory after years of crisis. My physical recovery plateaued after 2 years of intensive therapy. I could walk unassisted for short distances, but needed a cane for anything longer. My hands maintained a slight tremor that made fine motor tasks difficult. Dialysis remained a permanent feature of my life 3 times weekly, unless I qualified for a transplant, which seemed unlikely given my other health complications. I'd never be a pilot, and I'd lost the career I'd spent years pursuing, but I found work as a consultant for medical device companies, providing patient perspective on diabetes management technology. The job was sedentary and flexible around my dialysis schedule, and it used the knowledge I'd gained from living with type 1 diabetes. Not the future I'd imagined, but a future nonetheless. Kara completed her master's degree in nursing and specialized in critical care, motivated by her experience managing my medical crisis. She worked ICU shifts at a major hospital and came home with stories about patients fighting to survive that reminded both of us how close I'd come to dying. Our marriage had survived trauma that would have destroyed many relationships, and we'd built something strong from the ashes of what Garrett had tried to destroy. We'd moved past postponing our lives waiting for recovery, and had started building the future we could actually have, rather than mourning the one we'd lost. Small victories accumulated into something resembling peace. Alexis finished her doctorate and became a forensic scientist, inspired by her role uncovering evidence that put Garrett in prison. She specialized in cases involving medical crimes, helping prosecutors build cases against people who weaponized healthcare access or medications. She'd published papers about my case examining how initial investigations can miss signs of medical abuse, and she consulted with police departments about recognizing patterns. She'd transformed her anger about what happened to me into productive advocacy that helped other victims. Our relationship had strengthened through the crisis and investigation, and she remained one of the few family members I trusted unconditionally. 3 years after Garrett's conviction, a journalist contacted me about writing a book examining sibling violence and medical crimes. I initially declined, but eventually agreed when she explained her goal was educating people about recognizing and preventing similar situations. The book detailed Garrett's jealousy, his planning, the 2-minute video, my 2 years comatose, the investigation, and trial. It became a bestseller and sparked conversations about toxic family dynamics and the particular cruelty of weaponizing someone's medical condition. I donated my portion of proceeds to a foundation supporting diabetic patients who couldn't afford medications, finding purpose in helping prevent others from experiencing what Garrett had done to me. Garrett's first parole hearing would be in 33 years when he was 59 years old. I'd be 57 by then, likely still requiring dialysis, still living with the disabilities he'd caused, still carrying the knowledge that my own brother had tried to kill me for the crime of succeeding where he'd struggled. I'd submitted paperwork ensuring I'd be notified about every parole hearing and planned to submit opposition statements for each one. Garrett had shown no genuine remorse throughout trial, only self-pity and excuses, and I doubted prison would transform him into someone safe to release. He'd serve his full sentence if I had any say in the matter, and I intended to have a say. The question people asked most often was whether I'd forgiven Garrett. The answer was simple and final. No. Forgiveness implies some path to reconciliation, some possibility of restored relationship, some acknowledgement that the harm can be moved past. Garrett had tried to murder me, had stolen from people trying to help me survive, had performed loving brotherhood while profiting from my suffering, and had only expressed regret when facing consequences. There was no forgiveness possible for that combination of cruelty and calculation. The best I could manage was indifference, refusing to give him ongoing space in my thoughts or emotional energy. He was in prison where he belonged, and I was living my life. That was my revenge. 5 years after waking from the coma, I stood at a podium addressing a medical conference about patient safety and family violence. I told my story from the beginning, the insulin swap captured on video, the 2-year coma, the permanent disabilities, the investigation and trial. I showed the 2-minute video to an audience of healthcare professionals and watched their faces register shock and anger. Then I explained the warning signs they might see in patients, the ways medical sabotage could present, the importance of investigating inconsistencies rather than accepting family explanations at face value. Several attendees approached me afterward saying they'd encountered suspicious cases they'd dismissed as accidents, and my presentation had given them framework for recognizing potential crimes. Kara got pregnant in year 6 post-coma through IVF, since my fertility had been compromised by the ketoacidosis complications. We named our daughter Alexis after my sister, who'd saved my life by finding the evidence. Holding my daughter in the hospital, watching her tiny, perfect face, I felt something shift. Garrett had tried to steal my future, but here was proof he'd failed. I had a wife who'd stayed through hell, a sister who'd fought for justice, a daughter who represented possibility, and work that gave meaning to suffering. The life I had wasn't the one I'd planned before Garrett switched my insulin, but it was mine, and it was real, and it was worth living. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.